On 28th of July 1917, British pilot William Robinson Clark was flying his biplane over the Western Front, taking aerial photographs when he was attacked by 5 German aircraft. He recalled, "Before I could get away, I got a bullet in the spine. I managed to pilot the machine nearly back to the aerodrome, but had to put her down as I was too weak to fly anymore." Sergeant Clark was still recuperating in hospital in 1918 as the RAF was formed. He stood out not just for his bravery, but also because he came from Jamaica, and he was one of the few Negroes and other persons of colour, as official language put it, from British-ruled territories who were allowed to be recruited to the RAF in exceptional circumstances at the time. Officers were only supposed to be of pure European descent. Despite this latter ban on officers of colour, at a time of haphazard recruitment and manpower shortages, Clark might have been aware of Black RAF officer Lieutenant Alexander Patterson, whose father was from St Vincent and whose mother was a British nurse. Like the famous Walter Tull in the British Army, his promotion to a commission broke the official colour bar. Sergeant William Robinson Clark himself was accepted for service, partly because of the lightness of his skin where others were refused. But how would such patriotic volunteers fare once the war was over? In November 1918, soldiers of the British West Indies Regiment awaited demobilisation in Taranto, Italy. After distinguished military service in the Middle East, they were given heavy labour tasks. Their pay was not increased to the level awarded to white troops, and the black soldiers were humiliated by cleaning out the latrines of white regiments. Not surprisingly, they mutinied. Afterwards, members of the regiment met to form the Caribbean League, calling for equal rights and self-determination. Radicalised ex-servicemen returned to their homes to join bitter strikes sweeping the Caribbean at the time. A secret colonial memo of 1919 noted, "Nothing we can do will alter the fact that the black man has begun to think and feel himself as good as the white." In the 1920s and 1930s, Britain still controlled many island colonies and territories in the Caribbean. Around 80% of their populations were descended from enslaved Africans brutally transported across the Atlantic by the British to work on plantations. The British slave trade was abolished in 1807 and slavery itself in 1834. Each island or territory had its own unique identity, a complex mix of African, European and indigenous cultural influences. Poverty and unemployment were very high among the around 2.5 million inhabitants between the world wars. British racial attitudes towards black people hardened after 1918. Most white British people of the time assumed European and particularly British civilization was innately superior to other cultures. This belief was underpinned by the growing influence of 19th century racial science, which placed black Africans and their descendants at the bottom of a racial hierarchy, with white Europeans at the top. Although Caribbeans had fought both bravely for and against Britain in past centuries, negative stereotypes persisted. In 1923, the RAF determined that all recruits must be of pure European descent. Despite post-war unrest, the Caribbean populations mostly regarded themselves as loyally British. Children were usually educated in small, rural, mixed-age classrooms, taught British geography, history and literature, and learned to sing God Save the King in assemblies. They learned little about their own islands or their own history. Most received no secondary schooling, but the education standards could be very high and superior to that in some European countries. The British Caribbean had one of the highest literacy rates in the world. White people amounted to about 3%, while a proportion of the population in particular places, such as Trinidad, were of South Asian indentured labour descent, known as East Indians. However, race relations were usually more relaxed in the Caribbean than in other parts of the empire, and many people were of mixed descent, like RAF veteran William Patterson. As a general rule, those with lighter skins like him were more likely to succeed in society. However, British racism prevented volunteers like Lieutenant Patterson and Sergeant Clark from serving in the RAF between the World Wars. What might it take to change this? The Great Depression of the 1930s increased unemployment and poverty in both Britain and its Caribbean colonies. With falling wages, higher prices and lower demand for exports, strikes and sometimes violent unrest swept the British Caribbean in the late 1930s. This was underpinned by resentment towards plantation owners and British colonial rule, with calls for self-determination or independence. In 1938, the British government appointed a royal commission headed by Lord Moyne, which visited Jamaica on a tour of the Caribbean to collect evidence and make recommendations for the improvement of the dire living conditions in this neglected corner of the empire. Its modest recommendations for reform were not published until after the Second World War. In the meantime, the RAF in Britain, eager to expand its numbers in the face of the Nazi threat, struggled to implement its colour bar, even as it denied its existence in public. One J.F. Adam was initially rejected internally in 1936 because he could not prove the purity of his European descent, and because the RAF claimed that this boy is definitely coloured. When the boy's father produced a family tree claiming to prove his European descent, going back 3 generations, the RAF reluctantly enlisted Adams because they would have had to admit his rejection was on grounds of his appearance alone. Recruiters had not failed him on his medical, as sometimes conveniently happened. A Cheshire applicant, James Blake, was rejected ostensibly because of his lack of knowledge of electrical engineering. In fact, it was noted that the boy is of strikingly non-European appearance, having coal-black hair and a yellow skin. He therefore appears to be of Indian rather than Negroid descent. During the interwar years, half-caste individuals, those from mixed backgrounds, were regarded as weak, of bad character and as unlikely to fit in with other recruits. As war approached, the RAF needed manpower, but deliberately restricted its supply of potential recruits through racist processes. Meanwhile, the Caribbean colonies had a potential supply of recruits, but was seething with discontent. How might the actual outbreak of war change these situations? Despite local discontent, Caribbean colonies rallied around the mother country loyally when war broke out in September 1939. They were automatically at war anyway, as they were controlled by Britain. Commenting on his upbringing, Jamaican RAF veteran Billy Strachan said, "We'd been brought up to be so British. I think of my youth as much more British than the average British child. We sang God Save the King at breakfast. Like the majority of people in the Caribbean, and I'm talking about 90%, Britain was home, our homeland. We were all proud to be British." In October 1939, the RAF announced that it would temporarily recruit non-Europeans. This was what was said officially, at least. The Colonial Office and the Ministry of Information believed that this would rally support for the war effort from the Empire when manpower was short. In practice, it was not easy to get to Britain in wartime, and few volunteers were accepted for service at this stage. One exception was the 19-year-old Billy Strachan, who sold my bicycle and my saxophone and got on a ship and left Jamaica with about £2.10 and a small case with 1 change of clothes. He arrived at Bristol Station in March 1940, totally unused to seeing white people employed in ordinary jobs. He recalled, "A porter came towards me in his uniform. 'Your case, sir,' he said, and I saluted him. I thought he was a bloody admiral." Billy was the only non-white, non-British person, as he put it, in a training squad of 50, of which he was put in charge. He was shaken to be referred to as darky by his sergeant, but my chest swelled out because I was regarded as a man fit to be promoted to second airman in the RAF. Billy trained as a pilot at Cranwell and had a personal servant or batman who had once served the king. From Billy's experience, it might appear that white British people were universally happy to see colonials like him serve in the British Isles. This propaganda poster was designed for a British audience in 1940, when the country had lost its major ally, France, to defeat and relied on Commonwealth countries, colonial forces and exiles from European states occupied by the Nazis to carry on fighting. It gives the impression of imperial unity and solidarity behind the mother country in defence of freedom. But closer observers would have noted that soldiers of colour from India and West Africa are in the rear. No Caribbean soldiers, sailors or airmen were depicted. Racial stereotypes of Caribbean people, West Indians, as unintelligent, unable to follow complex orders, lazy and prone to drunkenness persisted in British ministries. The RAF admitted South Asians from May 1940 onwards. 24 pilots fought in the Battle of Britain. But this was out of a belief that Asiatics were more martial than Negroes. Although Billy Strachan never experienced racism himself, he reflected, "When you arrived in England anywhere as a black man, you were treated like a teddy bear. You were loved and feted. 2 black men they coped with. It was when 3 or more came that racism really got sharp, showing this inherent fear or threat." But how might attitudes change as the war continued with Britain's future still in the balance? With the RAF now desperately short of men after the Battle of Britain, the Air Force gave in to pressure from the Colonial Office and started seriously recruiting, mostly for ground crew, in the Caribbean colonies. Young Caribbeans joined for a variety of reasons. Some did so out of patriotism, which was stoked by British officers going into all the little corners of Jamaica, literally begging you to come and fight for England, according to Jamaican Connie Mark. Some took the threat posed by fascism very seriously. Edwin Martin Noble of Jamaica recalled, "I had made up my mind that no self-respecting, able-bodied young man could remain at home when the fate of the world was literally at stake in Europe." The mixed motivations remembered by Trinidadian Ulrich Cross were perhaps more typical. "I was young, adventurous, idealistic. The whole idea of being a member of the Royal Air Force was romantic. Most of my friends thought I was mad. I thought I was doing the right thing in trying to stop Hitler. I never felt I was going to the aid of the mother country. Some people did, but the majority of us didn't." Some volunteers wished to exchange the poverty and unemployment of the Caribbean for a secure wage, better economic prospects, and wider horizons. Cy Grant, from British Guyana, recalled, "I felt frustrated with the colonial way of life. I knew that the colony was too small to hold me." Once he became more familiar with Britain's imperial system, Grant found his motivation for participating in the war shifting. He said, "My ambition was to help get the British out of the West Indies." Some recruits were very clear about what the fate of the Caribbean might have been if the British had lost the war. When pressed on how she came to serve an empire which oppressed people of colour, Lillian Bader, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, later said, "We black people would have ended up in the ovens. British patriotism felt in the Caribbean was profound and not just among those who volunteered. £20,000 was raised in the first 10 days alone of a press campaign in Jamaica in 1941 to pay for 12 bombers, a huge and impressive sum at the time from a poor island. In gratitude, Churchill officially designated RAF Squadron 139 as Jamaica Squadron, a distinction it still carries to this day. Over 400 people of colour, many from the Caribbean, are estimated to have served as aircrew in the RAF during the Second World War. Some, like Ulrich Cross and John Blair, gained commissions, both of whom were awarded Distinguished Service Order medals for their brave conduct. Johnny Smythe, from Sierra Leone, was shot down in a bombing raid over Germany. He recalled, "We were flying at 16,000 feet when the fighters came out of nowhere. They wrecked the fuselage and there were flames everywhere. I was hit by shrapnel. We all parachuted and I landed among some trees." Smythe took shelter, but when I walked out of the barn, pandemonium broke out. The Germans couldn't believe their eyes. They were shocked to see a black man. But when they realised I was also an officer, they flatly refused to believe their eyes. Another RAF captive, Cy Grant's photograph, was featured in Volkischer Beobachter, a Nazi newspaper, with the caption, "A member of the RAF of indeterminate race." It was intended to highlight how Nazi Germany defended racial purity compared to degenerate Britain. War encouraged strong friendships between men of different backgrounds, particularly among multinational RAF bomber crews, 44% of whom perished. White Englishman Andrew Cole asked Errol Barrow from Barbados to fly with him. "We agreed to put our lives in each other's hands," he said, and became friends for life. Air Gunners Sergeant J.C. Dickinson, Royal Canadian Air Force, and Sergeant Leslie Gilkes, 9 Squadron, are seen here chatting in 1943. Sergeant Dickinson survived the war, but Trinidadian Sergeant Gilkes was shot down and killed on 3rd of August 1943, having no known grave. Despite this comradely equality, Caribbean aircrew were usually prevented from rising to the rank of pilot on the racist assumption that white crew members would not obey them. In September 1943, advertisements in Jamaica's The Daily Gleaner newspaper announced, "Recruitment for RAF begins today." It called for male volunteers between the ages of 18 and 32 to sign up. Similar advertisements appeared in other colonies. In June and November 1944 and in March 1945, contingents of Caribbean recruits arrived in Britain to an official welcome and hot drinks from the ladies of the WRVS. They were sent for basic training to RAF Hunmanby Moor, an ex-Butlins holiday camp at Filey in Yorkshire. They were treated well and welcomed by local people, most of whom had never seen a black person before, but recognised in these men volunteers who had come to fight for Britain, far away from home. Some struggled with the cold weather and a diet that included the unfamiliar roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, and overcooked potatoes and cabbage. A Caribbean veteran later referred to all these black men, white men, Chinese, all these different colours, different shades of people, different nationalities, all talking the same way, and we all got on so well. Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Barbadians, Guyanese, we were all one. The Colonial Office employed welfare officers towards the end of the war, many of them ex-flyers such as Johnny Smythe and Billy Strachan, to look after the interests of the recruits, smoothing relations with the Air Force. Mostly shielded from prejudice by these officers, as well as by service regulations, conditions were improved. One of the recruits to arrive in November 1944 was teenager Prince Albert Jake Jacob from Trinidad, a local RAF veteran. While the RAF proudly boasted in official propaganda that no colour bar existed to recruitment, it internally debated the restoration of one as soon as the war was over. In response, the Air Secretary argued that to erect a colour bar against an officer who had earned a DFC would be indefensible and barbaric. In all, it is estimated that 6,000 Caribbeans were recruited to the RAF during the Second World War, most serving as ground crew. But what lay ahead for the survivors in post-war Britain? On 27th of April 1948, Prince Albert Jake Jacob married his wartime sweetheart, Mary Gore, at Oldbury Registry Office in Birmingham. He was a Black RAF veteran from Trinidad, and she was white, English and Jewish. Jake's family were too far away to come. Such was her father's objection to the match that none of Mary's family attended the wedding. The couple were subjected to discrimination in post-war austerity Birmingham. People shouted to Mary across the street that she should not be with Jake. But how did it come to this? That a happy couple, very much in love, received so much criticism, when Jake had been made welcome in Yorkshire just 4 years before for his RAF training. As the Second World War closed, the RAF restored the pre-war colour bar towards recruitment as an unwritten rule. Despite the contribution of Caribbeans to the war effort, Air Marshal Sir John Slessor is recorded in a September meeting as saying a gentleman who looks as though he has just dropped out of a tree is clearly unlikely to make as good an officer or NCO as an otherwise less highly qualified white man because the men won't take it from him. The number of black people employed in the RAF rapidly declined with demobilisation, even after the colour bar was quietly lifted again in 1947. Official policy repatriated colonials as soon as possible, although they were entitled to receive RAF training for employment in a trade before they left. RAF veteran Johnny Smythe was employed by the Colonial Office to help veterans get back into work in the Caribbean. However, economic conditions in the Caribbean colonies were still very poor and unemployment was high. Meanwhile, a war-weary and debt-ridden Britain, now subjected to even more severe rationing, had an estimated 1.3 million job vacancies to fill as the country's blitzed towns and cities were rebuilt. An appeal went out to the Commonwealth and Empire for workers. The British Nationality Act of 1948 confirmed that British subjects throughout the remaining empire, but also citizens of newly independent Commonwealth countries, such as India, had the right to settle freely in the United Kingdom. The government organised programmes for Europeans displaced by the war and prisoners of war to work and settle in the UK. Caribbeans desperate for work, some with skilled training in a trade from their time in the RAF, noticed the plentiful advertisements for labour in British newspapers they were sent. On 22nd of June 1948, the Empire Windrush arrived at Tilbury Docks in Essex, carrying 1,027 passengers. 802 passengers gave their last country of residence as somewhere in the Caribbean, and most of these intended to settle in the UK. Many of the men were RAF veterans who knew Britain well and had a skilled trade. They were supported on board by veteran Johnny Smythe, who was now a senior officer on the ship. Pathé News, seen in cinemas across the UK, covered the event positively, commenting that they served this country well. In Jamaica, they couldn't find work. Discouraged but full of hope, they sailed for Britain, citizens of the British Empire coming to the mother country with good intent. But behind the official welcome, they were not wanted. Prime Minister Clement Attlee privately referred to the arrival of these Caribbean migrants as an incursion and suggested diverting the Empire Windrush to Africa, where its passengers could be employed as agricultural workers picking groundnuts. The British Nationality Act had been passed to ease white migration between Britain and mostly white-populated dominions such as Canada. It was not foreseen at the time that it might lead to extensive migration of brown and black British subjects or Commonwealth citizens. Black RAF veterans returning to Britain as part of the Windrush generation of economic migrants like Jake Jacob found little welcome in the mother country they had made sacrifices for in war. There were racist assumptions made that people of colour would never be able to integrate into British society, even though Caribbean people were steeped in knowledge of Britain through their education. Veterans no longer had the support of colonial office welfare officers, nor did RAF regulations protect them from discrimination. They found accommodation hard to come by and encountered signs warning, "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish." In effect, a housing colour bar. Black people were routinely barred from hotels, dances, social clubs and jobs within Birmingham's public transport system. Black men daring to dance with white women could be assaulted. Although there were plenty of job vacancies as the economy began to boom in the 1950s, black people could often find only the lowliest employment. Jake Jacob recalled that in Birmingham, there was a lot of work, but for a black man, you couldn't get a job unless you were willing to sweep the floor or do the lowest of the low. Then you couldn't get a job no matter how well educated you were. He also recalls white people touching his hair on buses. Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill, back in office in 1951, grew increasingly concerned about the growth of black communities. He asked chief constables to report confidentially to him in response to the question, "Is it true that the coloured community as a whole, or particular sections of it, are generally idle or poor workmen, live under bad conditions either from choice or out of necessity, or are addicted to drug trafficking or other types of crime?" Churchill even considered running his next general election campaign under the slogan, "Keep Britain White." Some white British people made their new neighbours feel welcome. Jake and Mary Jacob were befriended by members of Mary's Jewish community, and Jake was helped into a successful career as a post office manager with support from an RAF association. However, it was hard for Caribbeans to stomach the discrimination and rejection in a land they had long thought of as home. Could things get any worse? Barbadian George Phillips joined the RAF at the age of 21 as an electrician in London, having emigrated in 1955. He wanted to travel with the service. George later commented that, "There were a lot of black guys from various islands and they all got on well." This shows that the RAF was still recruiting from people with Caribbean backgrounds. However, numbers were far fewer than during the Second World War. George recalled that he and his black colleagues were challenged and physically searched when returning to their base from leave, while white servicemen were not. When they complained, a white guard was removed from his duties. In the early 1960s, the proportion of coloured recruits was being pegged at no more than 2% across the armed forces. Some elite regiments still recruited whites only. Racial tensions in Britain worsened in the late 1950s. Following on from a race riot in Nottingham, far-right white youths and demonstrators attacked the 5,000-strong black community in Notting Hill, London, in September 1958. Social problems in migrant areas were usually blamed on the very presence of migrants of colour in Britain, rather than white racist attacks such as this. Racism and racist street slogans against people of colour spiked. Claudia Jones set up the Notting Hill Carnival as a celebration of Caribbean identities in 1959 as a reaction. Behind the scenes, ministers and officials desperately searched for means of restricting black and brown Commonwealth migration without appearing to be racist. Rumours that immigration would soon be restricted ironically caused the number of Caribbean migrants to increase nationally from 15,000 in 1958 to 57,000 in 1960. The Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962 created distinctions of skilled or unskilled migrants, with or without offers of work. As was intended, the new law blocked most migrants of colour from entering the UK. Home Secretary Rab Butler commented, "The great merit of this scheme is that it can be presented as making no distinction on grounds of race or colour." This occurred in the same year as Jamaica gained independence from Britain. Other colonies followed over time. Local Black RAF veteran Donald Campbell remembers celebrating Jamaican Independence Day on August the 6th happily as a boy without really understanding what it meant. Meanwhile, in Smethwick, local white working class resentment towards migrants of colour boiled over into an unexpected victory for a racist Tory councillor to win the constituency at the 1964 general election. In November, the Birmingham Post reported that 12 white angry housewives were petitioning the council to buy up houses in Marshall Street, Smethwick, as they became vacant, and to let them only to white residents. Local activists invited world-famous African-American civil rights activist Malcolm X to visit Marshall Street in February 1965. "I was in Birmingham, Alabama the other day," he told reporters. "This will give me a chance to see if Birmingham, England is any different." He was refused a drink at a local pub as he knew he would be. Shortly afterwards, Malcolm X was assassinated. In the same month, young Donald Campbell arrived in Birmingham from Jamaica to join his parents, fascinated by the long-lying snow he had never seen before. The 1965 and 1968 Race Relations Acts banned forms of racial discrimination in Britain for the first time, but on 20th of April 1968, Conservative MP for Wolverhampton, Enoch Powell, gave an inflammatory speech to a party meeting in Birmingham, where he warned that if mass migration was not controlled, it would lead to rivers of blood. He quoted a letter sent to him claiming that, "In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man." As a Conservative minister in the 1950s, Powell had actively recruited nurses from the Caribbean to serve in the NHS. Growing up in Wolverhampton in the 1960s, local Black RAF veteran Karen Keller remembers being told by a white child that, "My dad didn't fight in the World War for you." It fed her determination to prove by serving in the RAF that she was just as good, if not better, than any white recruit. On the other hand, local black veteran John Winston Clark, born to a poor black family in Smethwick in the same period, remembers that everyone got on well in their diverse area, despite tensions in Marshall Street nearby. But how would the rising generation of Black Britons, many of whom had been born in the UK, see their lives change in the 1970s and 1980s? The 1970s were viewed as a period of national decline at the time in Britain, although living standards in general continued to grow. 1974 saw 2 general elections in the same year and much industrial unrest in the country. The 1971 Immigration Act curbed further Commonwealth migration, while the 1976 Race Relations Act tightened up the law on discrimination. With increasing unemployment, support for the far-right National Front grew. On 13th of August 1977, 500 white members of the National Front attempted a march in Lewisham, South London, an area with a strong black community. Thousands of counter-demonstrators were caught up in violent clashes with the police and the NF marchers in a conflict known as the Battle of Lewisham. The battle is usually seen as a significant defeat for the National Front in its attempts to intimidate Black Britons and force a policy of repatriation on the British government. Many second-generation Black Britons whose parents had migrated with the Windrush now took part in activism against racism and discrimination across Britain, including in the West Midlands. They objected to prejudice, high unemployment, poverty, low-quality housing and police harassment. Rastafarianism and its musical culture gained influence as some second-generation Black Britons distanced themselves from their Caribbean backgrounds, traditional Christian churches, and their more conservative parents. Some were drawn to left-wing and Pan-African ideologies and took part in campaigning against apartheid. As a child in West Bromwich, Black RAF veteran Brian Hughes Scott missed out on a place at grammar school as a result of discrimination. Some other local veterans also had experience of low academic expectations of themselves as Black pupils. Margaret Thatcher led the Conservatives to victory in the general election of 1979, introducing controversial economic policies which cut public spending, privatised industries, and led to an increase in unemployment. This coincided with specific discontent in Black urban communities. On the 18th of January 1981, 13 Black teenagers and young people were killed in the New Cross fire in South London. The police resisted local pressure to investigate claims that the fire might have been the result of a racist arson attack. On the 10th and 12th of April 1981, the Metropolitan Police and mostly Black youths clashed in a series of violent encounters in Brixton, an already deprived part of London where the Caribbean community suffered disproportionately from high unemployment, crime, and poor housing. The violence, injuries, burning of police vehicles and looting of some shops and buildings was partly triggered by Operation Swamp 81, where the largely white police force used the hated sus laws to search and arrest hundreds of Black people, most of whom were not charged with any offence. Rioting also occurred between Black youths and police in Handsworth, Birmingham. This was one of a number of copycat disturbances that occurred across some British cities following Brixton. A far more serious riot occurred in Handsworth again in 1985, where over 50 shops were burned or looted. Local Black RAF veterans serving in the RAF in the 1970s and 1980s had mixed experiences. In the 1980s, Jeff Nelson experienced racism playing rugby in Northern Ireland, where he was shoved and verbally abused while in Cyprus banana skins were draped across the handlebars of his motorcycle. Military police close by had not intervened. Brian Hughes Scott experienced delayed promotion compared to white colleagues, as did some other veterans. On the other hand, Kenneth Strawn was employed on aircraft of the Queen's flight from the mid-1970s, which enhanced his promotion prospects. Karen Keller worked successfully as an RAF chef at Chequers, the country residence of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, where she was treated well. In 1982, John Winston Clark joined the RAF from a deprived background but with a strong state educational record. He undertook basic training as an airman at RAF Swinderby. A white RAF sergeant expressly warned his class of white colleagues against using racist slurs towards their only Black recruit. The RAF carefully nurtured John's ambitions to become an officer and flyer, and in 1986 he attended Cranwell, subsequently training as a navigator. Throughout his career, he felt protected from racism by his RAF colleagues. All veterans interviewed for this project appreciated the structure provided by service life and the opportunities to travel it gave them, including to Germany, the Falklands, Cyprus, Oman, Madagascar, Iraq and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, as the 1980s closed, Black British identity grew in confidence and visibility. Black faces featured regularly in entertainment, broadcasting and sport. 4 Black MPs were elected to Parliament in 1987, 2 of them from Caribbean backgrounds. These were Diane Abbott, who was the daughter of Jamaican parents, and Bernie Grant, who was born in British Guyana. The first Black History Month was held in London that year. It has since become a means of celebrating Black history in many schools and communities across the UK. Black History Month has helped to forge a sense of what it means to be both Black and British. In 1993, local Black RAF veteran Jeff Nelson was encouraged by fellow local Black veteran John Winston Clark to apply to become an officer in the service like himself. Like John, Jeff came from a deprived background in the West Midlands. John had been spotted as having the potential to become an officer early on in his career and had been supported by the RAF in his ambitions. John saw the same potential in Jeff. On taking the exams to see if he could enter Cranwell, Jeff was told that he had been turned down as a borderline case. Quite pleased that he had come close to winning a commission, Jeff prepared to apply again. He then discovered that someone in the selection process had put down the phrase skin pigmentation on his documentation as a deciding factor in turning him down. Jeff quit the RAF and joined the police, where he received active encouragement from white colleagues in challenging racism when he encountered it. How did this make sense for the same institution to be promoting a Caribbean recruit in one instance and discriminating against someone from the same background in another? Other British institutions faced accusations of racism in the 1990s. Jeff Nelson's experience of his local police force was positive and affirming. The experience of the family of Stephen Lawrence at the hands of the Metropolitan Police in 1993 was anything but. Black A-level student Stephen Lawrence was murdered by a group of white men while waiting for a bus in London. Police investigations did not result in any convictions for his murder. His parents led a public campaign complaining about the ineffectiveness of police inquiries. Sir William Macpherson's official inquiry into how the Metropolitan Police handled their investigations of Stephen's murder concluded in 1999 that these were marred by a combination of professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure of leadership by senior officers. The report led to detailed targets for the recruitment, retention, and promotion of Black and Asian officers, as well as the creation of the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Part of the solution to systematically tackling discrimination appeared to be holding institutions more closely to account to agreed standards. Pressure grew on the armed forces in the mid-1990s when a scandal broke exposing the continued existence of a colour bar for elite military regiments, continued racism in the army, and a culture of fear experienced by Black soldiers. Things began to change. The RAF collected data on the ethnicity of its personnel for the first time in 1996. 1.2% came from ethnic minorities. In 1998, the Ministry of Defence agreed to work in partnership with the powerful Commission for Racial Equality, who had exposed the army scandal. It was decided that the armed forces, including the RAF, would set targets for recruitment of ethnic minorities, increase the number of ethnic minority officers, remove barriers to promotion, and promote a non-racist environment. The renaming of Tate Gardens in Brixton as Windrush Square in 1998 was a sign that black communities were in the UK to stay. It remained to be seen if British institutions had come to terms with that by treating all citizens fairly and justly. From 2000, Black British identity continued to become embedded in British society. Paul Boateng, MP, became the first Black cabinet minister in a UK government in 2002. Other Black ministers became a feature of later governments. A national poll in 2003 voted a British Jamaican, Mary Seacole, who nursed British soldiers during the Crimean War, 1854 to 1856, as the greatest Black Briton. Her story is now widely taught in primary schools. John Sentamu was enthroned as the first Black Archbishop of York in 2005. Meanwhile, by 2006, the RAF had increased its proportion of ethnic minority personnel to 2.2%, 0.4% identified as Black Caribbean. Local Black RAF veteran John Winston Clark flew in the Iraq War as a squadron leader and helped to organise training in Britain for British land forces deployed to Afghanistan between 2005 and 2008. In 2012, Black volunteers played Windrush migrants coming to Britain in 1948 during the spectacular Olympic opening ceremony in London, showing that their arrival was now accepted as a part of British history. However, resentment at recent migration into the UK from Eastern Europe fed into the divisive Brexit referendum of 2016, where the public voted by a narrow majority to leave the European Union. Conservative Home Secretary Theresa May announced a new hostile environment towards illegal migration. From 2013 onwards, many Windrush generation residents were treated unfairly as illegal immigrants because they could not prove their right to remain from before 1973. They could be told to leave at once. Some lost their jobs or homes as a result of benefit cuts, could no longer access the NHS, were placed in detention and were deported with no right of return. At least 83 people were wrongly deported. It meant that some in the Windrush generation questioned their British identity after decades of residence. In 2018, 81-year-old RAF veteran from Barbados, Desmond Garnes, who joined in 1960, said to an interviewer, "My time in this country and what I've done should be enough to justify my stay here." Only some of those eligible for compensation ever received any, and some had already died. A refreshing new take on a multicultural Britain seemed to be offered by the fairy tale wedding of Prince Harry to Afro-American actress Meghan Markle in 2018 at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. This was the first time that a person of colour had married into the British royal family. However, the couple left the UK in 2020 for a new life in California, after accusing parts of the British media and members of the royal family and royal household of racism towards Meghan. How would the monarchy and other British institutions, such as the RAF, come to terms with race relations in the 2020s? On the 7th of June 2020, a crowd of demonstrators defaced and toppled the bronze Victorian statue of British slave trader Sir Edward Colston into the waters of Bristol docks. They were supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was energised by worldwide coverage of the killing of African-American George Floyd by a white policeman. Even as Britain and other countries struggled with the impact of the COVID pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement prompted a re-evaluation of the legacy of the British Empire and colonialism, with controversies about which public monuments in Britain should be retained. School and university curricula were diversified and decolonised. Black footballer Marcus Rashford gained popularity campaigning successfully during the pandemic for better government provision for poor families. But members of the England football team, including Rashford and other black players, were criticised for taking the knee during the singing of the national anthem. When Rashford and other black players missed vital penalties in a game, they faced racist abuse online, and Rashford's mural in Manchester was vandalised. This was part of a reaction against a so-called woke ideology, which strongly divided political opinion in an unstable environment of polarised views, populist politics, and a sometimes toxic social media. England manager Gareth Southgate wrote an open letter to fans defending his young team. He wrote that, "What cannot be questioned about the current generation of England players is their pride in representing this country." In the 2020s, ethnic minorities, including people of colour, make major, visible contributions to public life. Rishi Sunak was appointed as the first South Asian Prime Minister in October 2022, presiding over a diverse cabinet. 90 ethnic minority and black MPs sit in the Parliament elected in 2024. Kemi Badenoch, the current leader of the opposition, is descended from Nigerian migrants. On the 6th of May 2023, Charles III was crowned king at Westminster Abbey. The traditional ceremony demonstrated that the Windrush generation were embedded in national life. British Trinidadian peer Floella Benjamin carried the royal sceptre, and the British Dominican Baroness Scotland read from the Bible as Secretary-General of the Commonwealth. The Prime Ministers of the remaining Caribbean realms processed into the Abbey behind their national flags, although these may become republics over time, as some already have. In June 2023, the RAF were criticised for unlawfully putting ethnic minority and female recruits on a fast track to promotion to the disadvantage of 31 white men. The Air Force admitted that its target of a 40% female and 20% ethnic minority force by 2030 was unrealistic. How far things had come in 100 years when the RAF of 1923 deliberately excluded non-Europeans. It is striking too that local black veteran Prince Albert Jake Jacob, who was recruited to the RAF in Trinidad and served between 1944 and 1947, was only awarded his long overdue service medals from the British state in 2022 at the age of 97, after a kindly neighbour applied for them on his behalf.